The Zhurkar scout ship entered Earth's atmosphere in a slow descent, the sleek metallic hull shimmering as it passed through the stratosphere. The crew of the ship, elite scouts of the Zhurkar reconnaissance fleet, had a singular purpose: to survey potential planets for invasion. They had done this countless times before, and Earth seemed no different. Its technology was laughably primitive compared to their intergalactic capabilities, and its environment posed no real threat, or so they thought. The desert below stretched for miles in all directions, a vast expanse of rolling dunes under a relentless sun. It seemed lifeless, devoid of anything worth noting, and the Zhurkar's advanced scanning technology confirmed this. No resources, no hidden dangers. Just sand. Their ship hovered for a moment before setting down softly on the edge of a dune, the heat from the planet's surface barely registering to the insulated hull. Inside, Commander Zisrak observed the readings with disinterest. "Why would anyone want to live here?" he muttered, his voice echoing through the chamber, cold and mechanical. His crew of 5 scouts, each taller and leaner than a human, sat at their stations. Their bodies, covered in smooth, reflective exoskeletons, gleamed in the artificial light of the control room. "Primitive life forms," said one of the scouts, Lieutenant Kator, glancing at the screen. "Their technology is centuries behind ours. They barely even use proper energy sources. These deserts? Useless. There's nothing here worth fighting over." The commander smirked, a gesture that didn't translate well on his alien features. "That's why we're here, isn't it? To confirm what we already know. Earth will be easy to conquer, and this desert is of no strategic value." He dismissed the idea of any significant resistance from the humans. After all, their civilizations had thrived in dense urban environments, relying on large infrastructures. The Zhurkar's intelligence reports suggested that Earth's military forces were well versed in traditional, organized combat, but desert warfare? That was ancient history, irrelevant in modern warfare. And certainly irrelevant to the Zhurkar, whose technology rendered such strategies obsolete. The planet's past conflicts involving deserts, their skirmishes, guerrilla tactics, and survival skills, seemed laughably crude to them. They had seen footage of human soldiers trudging through deserts, covered in sweat, relying on simple weapons and dated tactics. To the Zhurkar, this was no threat. How could beings so reliant on rudimentary survival instincts ever hope to challenge an advanced race like theirs? "Scan the area for any human activity," Commander Zisrak ordered, leaning back in his seat. "Let's confirm that it's as barren as it looks." The ship's scanners hummed to life, their sophisticated sensors sweeping over the dunes, the heat waves distorting the landscape. For a moment, there was only silence as the crew watched the results roll in. Nothing. No life signs. No structures. Just endless sand and an oppressive sun. "Nothing, sir," Kator confirmed. "As expected. No signs of human presence for hundreds of kilometers." The commander nodded, unsurprised. "Excellent. We'll mark this area as a non-threat and move on." The Zhurkar were an advanced species, their technology far beyond anything humanity could imagine. They had conquered worlds with environments far more dangerous than Earth's deserts, planets with toxic atmospheres, volcanic landscapes, and treacherous frozen wastelands. In comparison, Earth's deserts were nothing but an inconvenience, a minor footnote in their mission to evaluate the planet's defenses. But as they prepared to lift off, there was a disturbance. A small blip on the scanner, so faint it was almost dismissed as an error. One of the scouts frowned, adjusting the controls. "Wait! Commander, there's something." The crew turned their attention to the display, where a single heat signature appeared, faint and inconsistent. It was too small to be a vehicle or a larger threat, just a minor anomaly on the edge of their scanning range. "What is it?" Zisrak asked, his voice sharp with sudden interest. "Unsure," the scout replied, narrowing his eyes. "It's humanoid in size, but it's barely registering. Almost as if it's trying to stay hidden." "Human?" Kator scoffed. "In this desert? Impossible. No human could survive long out here, not without significant technology or supplies. They don't have the capacity." The commander considered this for a moment before shaking his head. It's likely nothing. Some desert animal perhaps, or a malfunction in our sensors. Proceed with the scan. Still, there was something unsettling about that lone blip on their scanners, something that lingered in the air even as the crew dismissed it. A small, silent anomaly in the vastness of the desert. But the Jurkar, confident in their superiority, were not concerned. Their technology would detect any real threat long before it became a problem. As the crew continued their assessment, they pulled up data on Earth's previous conflicts in desert environments. The commander watched clips of ancient human battles, grainy footage of soldiers trekking through sandstorms, battling against the odds in environments like this very desert. He couldn't help but laugh. How far they had come from those primitive days. To the Jurkar, desert warfare was a relic of a bygone era, no match for their modern military prowess. The idea of human soldiers using the desert to their advantage seemed absurd. The Jurkar could scan every inch of this wasteland with precision, neutralize any threat before it could even approach. Their energy shields could withstand the harshest conditions, and their advanced reconnaissance drones could navigate any terrain. The desert, to them, was just an inconvenience. Zisrak turned his attention back to the screens, the sense of superiority washing over him once more. He had no doubt that Earth would fall quickly, just as countless other worlds had before it. And this desert, with its scorching heat and shifting sands, would be no different. But outside, under the relentless sun, the desert held its own secrets. It was a place where only the hardiest survived, where tactics born out of necessity had been honed over centuries. And somewhere, hidden in the dunes, that faint heat signature moved with purpose, watching, waiting. The Jurkar might have dismissed the desert as insignificant, but the operator, unseen and unheard, knew better. He had learned long ago that the desert was a weapon in itself, one that could be wielded with deadly precision against those who underestimated it. And soon, the aliens would learn the cost of their arrogance. For now, though, the desert remained silent, as still as the Jurkar scouts assumed it would always be. But beneath the surface, unseen forces were already in motion, and the battle they had so confidently dismissed was about to begin. The operator lay still, his body blended into the dunes like a shadow that belonged to the desert itself. The midday heat was brutal, but he didn't flinch. His breathing was steady, slow, and deliberate, honed by years of training in conditions just like these. He had spent most of his career in the SAS moving through environments that punished weakness, jungles, mountains, and especially deserts. The desert was unforgiving, but it was also predictable, a place where the smallest misstep could kill you or your enemy. Here, he had the advantage. Years ago, in the remote stretches of Afghanistan, he had learned that the desert was not something to fight against but something to work with. The heat that drained the energy from your body, the sand that clogged your equipment, the barren expanses that offer no cover, these were not obstacles, but tools. Most people, even the enemy, didn't understand that. They came into the desert ill-prepared, reliant on technology, expecting brute force to win the day. But the operator knew better. He had seen too many soldiers break under the weight of their gear, their morale crushed by the endless heat and their minds shattered by isolation. This wasn't just another desert. This was home, at least for now. He shifted slightly, just enough to glance through the scope of his rifle. From his position, he had been watching the alien ship for hours, noting their movements, the way they seemed to disregard their surroundings, their confidence bordering on arrogance. They were too reliant on their tech, their advanced scanners and drones. They didn't respect the desert. They didn't respect him either, but that was their first mistake. They were good, he'd give them that. Their equipment was top of the line, alien or not. But technology wasn't everything. The Jurkar had clearly never fought in a place like this, and it showed in the way they moved, too fast, too bold. They underestimated the toll the desert would take on them. The operator, on the other hand, knew how to conserve his energy, how to disappear into the landscape. Out here, patience was key. The desert rewarded those who could wait. His experience in desert warfare had taught him that the real battle was one of attrition. It wasn't just about who had the best weapons or the most advanced technology. It was about who could outlast the other. The desert would claim the weak, whether by dehydration, heat stroke, or exhaustion. He'd seen it time and time again, both in his allies and his enemies. The key was to use the desert to break them before you even had to pull the trigger. He had been tracking the alien scouts since the moment they landed, moving in and out of the dunes with ease, his footsteps leaving almost no trace. The operator was a master of stealth, honed through decades of missions where detection meant death. Every movement he made was calculated, every footstep chosen with care. In the desert, silence was more powerful than any weapon. The Zhurkar, for all their advanced tech, hadn't noticed him. They couldn't. They didn't even know how to look for him. He thought back to his training, the brutal hours spent learning how to survive in places like this. The SAS didn't just train you to fight, they trained you to endure. How to conserve water, how to navigate by the stars, how to use the environment against your enemies. He had learned to wait, to listen to the desert. The wind, the shifting sands, even the movements of the wildlife, all of it told a story, all of it gave him information. Information the Zhurkar had no way of accessing. These aliens didn't know the land. They had tech that could scan for heat signatures and life forms, but none of that mattered when the heat of the day masked every living thing under a blanket of warmth. They couldn't see him because they didn't understand that he wasn't trying to hide from them in a conventional way. He was hiding in plain sight, using the desert as his shield. His body covered in a thin layer of sand, his gear camouflaged perfectly against the environment. Out here, he didn't need advanced technology. He needed to be invisible in the way the desert was invisible to those who didn't know how to see it. The Zhurkar were efficient, but they were also predictable. They moved in formations, their scouting patterns systematic, but lacking the fluidity needed for the desert. The operator had already spotted several weak points in their patrols. He could strike, but it wasn't time yet. He wasn't looking for a direct confrontation. He was looking to break them, to make them fear what they couldn't see. That's how you won in a place like this, not by overpowering the enemy, but by making them overthink, by forcing them into mistakes. He adjusted his position slightly, feeling the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky. The temperature would drop soon, and with it, the Zhurkar would begin to show their fatigue. They were machines, in a way, relying on their tech to sustain them, but machines still needed maintenance, and their bodies, no matter how advanced, were still biological. They would tire. They would start to doubt their equipment. They would begin to wonder if their scanners were malfunctioning, if they had made a mistake in dismissing this terrain as irrelevant. That was when he would strike. Out here, in the desert, the rules of engagement were different. It wasn't about meeting force with force. It was about surviving longer than your enemy, about using the environment to wear them down. The desert would strip them of their energy, their patience, their confidence. The operator didn't need to rush. Time was on his side. The longer he waited, the more the Zhurkar would begin to unravel, and when they did, he would be there to finish the job. He allowed himself a small smile beneath his camouflage. He had faced worse odds than this before. He had survived worse deserts, faced more dangerous enemies. These aliens, for all their superiority, were no different than the others who had come before them. They were unprepared for what this land could do to them, unprepared for someone like him. The operator settled back into the sand, his rifle steady, his mind focused. He had time. And in the desert, time was the greatest weapon of all. The first sign that something was wrong came when the Zhurkar scouts' drones malfunctioned. It was subtle at first, just a minor flicker in the feed, a brief distortion in the data. The crew shrugged it off, assuming it was an atmospheric anomaly. But as the drones flew deeper into the desert, they began losing connection altogether, their systems faltering in the oppressive heat and swirling sands. Kator, monitoring the drone feeds inside the ship, cursed under his breath as the screen in front of him went black for the third time. "The drones are down again," he muttered, his fingers moving swiftly over the controls to reset them. Commander Zisrak barely glanced up from his station. "Fix it. We need eyes on the ground." "I'm trying, sir. It's this damn desert. The heat's interfering with the sensors. And the sandstorms." Kotor's words were cut short by another flicker in the data. Find a way, Sisrak snapped, more irritated by the inconvenience than concerned. Our technology is superior. This primitive planet shouldn't be causing problems. But it was. The operator had seen to that. He had anticipated the drones the moment the ship landed. It was standard procedure for reconnaissance teams. They would rely on their machines to do the work for them, scouting from a distance, keeping their soldiers safe. The operator knew their tech was advanced, but it had one major flaw: it couldn't handle the desert like he could. He'd spent the better part of the day disabling their drones without them even realizing it. A carefully placed rock here, an intentional distortion in the sand there. He knew where to position himself to avoid detection, exploiting the natural interference of the sandstorms and the heat haze that warped the horizon. The Zhirkar, for all their intelligence, didn't know what they were up against. Out here, the desert was his ally, not theirs. As Kotor struggled with the drones, a small group of scouts was dispatched to investigate. 4 of them moved cautiously through the dunes, their weapons raised, their advanced suits providing minimal protection from the harsh conditions. They relied on their tech to guide them, confident that it would detect any threats long before they came into view. They had no idea how close they already were. The operator watched through the scope of his rifle, the 4 figures moving in predictable patterns. They moved like they were invincible, with no concern for cover or concealment. In any other environment, they might have been right. Their technology was formidable, their weapons devastating. But here, their arrogance was their weakness. The operator didn't need to engage directly. That wasn't his style. He had learned a long time ago that the best way to fight a superior force was to make them doubt themselves. Confusion, fear, hesitation, these were far more effective than bullets. He had already set up the first phase of his plan, leading the scouts toward a patch of unstable ground where the sand had shifted over time, leaving a treacherous drop just beneath the surface. As the lead scout stepped forward, the ground gave way beneath him, his body swallowed by the dune in an instant. The others froze, momentarily shocked by the sudden collapse of their comrade. They rushed forward to help, but it was too late. The desert had claimed him. The operator didn't move. He stayed still, watching, waiting. Panic began to creep into the remaining scouts. Their comrade was gone, and they had no idea how it had happened. The desert, which they had so casually dismissed, was starting to feel like a living thing, a hostile force that was actively working against them. The operator could see it in the way they moved now, slower, more cautious, constantly glancing around as if expecting the ground to open up beneath them again. That was the effect he wanted. One of the scouts radioed back to the ship, his voice tense. "We've lost a man. The ground's unstable. Requesting backup." Sisrak's voice crackled through the comms, impatient. "Proceed with caution. This terrain is unpredictable, but it's nothing we can't handle. You have your orders." The operator smiled. They still didn't get it. This wasn't about the terrain. This was about control. The desert was just a tool, he was the real threat, and they didn't even know it yet. He adjusted his rifle, lining up his next shot. He wasn't aiming to kill, at least not yet. This was psychological warfare. The Zhirkar needed to believe they were being hunted by something more than just the environment. They needed to think they were being watched, stalked by an unseen predator. He fired, the bullet hitting a rock just to the left of the nearest scout. It was a deliberate miss, a warning shot. The scout flinched, spinning toward the direction of the sound, his weapon raised, scanning the horizon. But there was nothing to see, just the endless dunes and the oppressive sun. The others followed suit, their formation breaking as they tried to locate the source of the shot. The operator shifted his position, moving silently across the sand, keeping low, always one step ahead of their gaze. They couldn't see him, and that was the point. Fear was a powerful weapon, and it was already starting to take hold. He could feel it in their movements, in the way they hesitated before every step, their heads constantly on a swivel. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the ground in front of one of the scouts. He stumbled back, his weapon shaking slightly in his hands. They were losing their nerve. The operator could sense it. But he wasn't done yet. As the scouts continued their increasingly frantic search for the shooter, the operator activated a small explosive he had buried earlier in the day, several meters away from their position. The blast wasn't large, just enough to send a plume of sand into the air and create more confusion. The scouts immediately dropped to the ground, their instincts kicking in too late. They were scattered now, unsure of where the threat was coming from, disoriented by the heat and the sudden chaos. This was the moment the operator had been waiting for. He took his first real shot, the bullet striking one of the scouts in the leg. The alien crumpled to the ground, his scream muffled by the wind and the sandstorm that was beginning to pick up. The others scrambled to cover him, their attention divided between the wounded and the invisible enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. In their desperation, they made the fatal mistake of grouping too closely together, trying to shield themselves from a threat they couldn't understand. The operator saw the opportunity and took it, launching a grenade that landed perfectly in their midst. The explosion rocked the dunes, the shockwave rippling through the sand. 2 of the scouts were killed instantly. The last one, wounded and alone, staggered to his feet, firing wildly into the desert, his panic finally overtaking him. He didn't stand a chance. The operator's final shot took him down, and then there was silence. The desert was still again, the only sound the wind carrying the echoes of the brief skirmish. The Gurkha scouts were gone, their arrogance shattered by an enemy they had never expected. The operator didn't move, watching the dunes settle once more. This was just the beginning. They still had more scouts, more technology, and more confidence that would need to be broken. But now they knew, someone was out here. And the desert was no longer the passive, barren wasteland they had once believed it to be. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a relentless heat that bore down on the desert. The Gurkha scouts were beginning to feel it. Their suits, once a fortress of technology designed to protect them from any hostile environment, were starting to falter. The desert was proving to be an enemy they hadn't anticipated, its constant, grinding pressure wearing on them in ways their tech couldn't counteract. Inside the ship, Zisrak was growing impatient. Reports from the ground were sparse, and the loss of contact with the initial team gnawed at him. He dismissed the idea that something as primitive as a human could be responsible for their disappearance. But something was wrong, and it was becoming harder to ignore. On the ground, the remaining scouts pushed on, but the toll was starting to show. Their water supplies, which had been calculated for a quick reconnaissance, were dwindling faster than expected. The heat was relentless, and despite the suit's capabilities, it was beginning to penetrate. Sweat clung to their skin, their mouths dried despite the hydration systems. Worse, the terrain seemed to shift beneath them, every step feeling like it led them further into a trap. What had been confidence before had turned into frustration. The drones were no longer operational, their systems overwhelmed by the sand and heat, and their technology, usually their greatest advantage, was proving useless in the face of the desert's overwhelming force. They were trained soldiers, used to hostile environments, but this desert was different. It wasn't just the heat or the endless expanse of sand, it was the feeling that they were being toyed with. The operator had not engaged again since the last ambush, but his presence was felt. Every now and then, the sound of shifting sand or a sudden gust of wind would make them freeze, scanning the horizon for a threat that never revealed itself. They were chasing shadows, and that was exactly how he wanted them to feel. He didn't need to fire another shot for now. They were already breaking down. He knew the signs well, the way their movements became slower, more cautious, the way they spoke in shorter bursts, as if conserving energy for what lay ahead. The desert was grinding them down, and they hadn't even realized they were fighting a war on 2 fronts, against him and against the very land they thought was nothing more than a barren wasteland. They had underestimated the desert, believing their technology would shield them from its effects, but they couldn't outlast it. No one could. The operator had seen stronger men crumble under the weight of the sun, watched as their resolve melted away with every passing hour. The desert had a way of stripping everything down to its most basic elements: willpower, endurance, and survival. It didn't matter how advanced their technology was. Out here, the battle was fought with patience, and the desert always had more of it than any soldier. The operator moved carefully through the dunes, observing them from a distance. They had spread out more, an attempt to cover more ground, but it only made them more vulnerable. He could see it in their movements, the small stumbles as they misjudged the softness of the sand, the way they paused too often, trying to assess their surroundings. They were exhausted, even if they didn't want to admit it. He had seen this many times before. Soldiers who entered the desert with full confidence in their gear, their training, their superiority. But the desert didn't care about any of that. It wore you down in small, unnoticeable ways. A misstep here, a few extra sips of water there. It drained your strength before you even realized it was happening. And by the time you did, it was too late. The Jurkar were no different. They had the same weaknesses, the same limitations. Their advanced suits and weapons could only do so much. The desert had already begun its work on them, and the operator was just nudging it along. He didn't need to engage directly. Not yet. He could wait, just like the desert. The longer he stayed hidden, the more their fear would grow. And fear was a weapon just as sharp as any blade. One of the scouts fell to his knees, struggling to rise again as the others moved to help. It was a small moment, but it told the operator everything he needed to know. Their supplies were running out, and with every hour that passed, their focus shifted from the mission to simple survival. They were losing control, and out here, that was the beginning of the end. The operator had been here before, different deserts, different enemies, but always the same game. He knew how to make them crack, how to push them just to the edge of their endurance before striking. It was never about the first shot or the biggest explosion. It was about letting the environment do the hard work for you, letting the desert strip them of their strength and their will to fight. He watched as they regrouped, huddling together in a small pocket of shade cast by a rocky outcrop. It was a temporary reprieve, but the operator knew it wouldn't last. They were exposed, and the sun was merciless. The Jurkar were starting to second-guess their own equipment, their trust in the technology that had never failed them before beginning to wane. That doubt was exactly what the operator needed. Doubt led to hesitation, and hesitation led to Back at the ship, the frustration was mounting. Zisrak barked orders over the comms, demanding updates, but the answers were always the same: no sign of the enemy, no visual on the source of the attack. It didn't make sense to them, but the operator knew it didn't have to. He was in their heads now, and that was all that mattered. He shifted his position again, staying low to the ground as the wind picked up. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, another gift from the desert, one he could use to his advantage. The Jurkar wouldn't be able to see him in the swirling clouds of sand, and their already malfunctioning tech would be even less reliable. It would be chaos, and in chaos, they would make mistakes. The operator could feel it. Victory was close. Not because he had superior firepower, but because he understood the battlefield in a way they never could. The desert was his weapon, and it was doing most of the work for him. The scouts were trying to communicate, their voices crackling through the interference as the storm began to sweep over the dunes. They were scrambling now, trying to hold their position, but the operator knew it was useless. The storm would isolate them, cut off their lines of sight, make them vulnerable. He waited, as patient as the desert itself, knowing that the real battle was almost over before it had truly begun. They would break, just like all the others before them. And when they did, he would be there, ready to finish what the desert had started. The final mission had arrived. After weeks of calculated strikes, precise kills, and careful evasion, the sniper had been given their most critical target yet, a leader so deeply entrenched in the coalition's operations that their death could tilt the balance of the entire war. This alien leader wasn't just another commander. They were the strategic mind behind much of the coalition's recent efforts to crush humanity. If this figure fell, the coalition's forces would falter, unable to regain their footing amidst the chaos that the snipers had already sown. The sniper knew the risks. This mission would be unlike any of the previous strikes. The target was fortified deep within a heavily protected compound, surrounded by layers of defenses that no ordinary soldier could breach. The area was crawling with guards, drones, and automated turrets, all calibrated to detect the faintest sign of an intrusion. The coalition had learned from its mistakes, tightening its defenses around key assets. This leader wasn't going to fall easily, but that was precisely why the sniper had been chosen for the job. There were no illusions about what this mission entailed. The sniper wasn't just here to take a shot and disappear as before. The level of protection around this target meant that every move had to be meticulously planned. There would be no room for error. The sniper had spent days preparing, watching from a distance, analyzing the patrol patterns, studying the structure's weak points, and calculating the exact timing needed to execute the kill and escape. Each moment leading up to the final shot had to be perfect. The target was inside a reinforced command center, surrounded by an energy field designed to repel all but the most powerful attacks. Standard firearms wouldn't even make a dent in it, and the coalition soldiers patrolled in constant rotation, overlapping their movements to prevent any gaps. But as the sniper knew all too well, no system was flawless. There was always a way in, a way through, even if it wasn't immediately obvious. The sniper's plan relied on a combination of factors the coalition still couldn't predict: human instinct, adaptability, and the ability to exploit opportunities that machines or alien algorithms couldn't account for. While the AI-driven defenses monitored for energy surges and heat signatures, they overlooked something as simple as a perfectly timed physical approach. The sniper's weapon had been modified for this mission, with enhanced penetration capability, designed to deliver a single, devastating shot through a narrow gap in the structure's defenses. Every breath, every movement had been calibrated to the unfolding environment. The sniper had already accounted for atmospheric changes, the angle of the shot, even the movements of the guards within the compound. As the sun began to dip behind the alien horizon, casting long shadows across the compound, the time to act had come. The final approach was executed with methodical precision. The sniper moved silently, staying low, watching the patrols pass by, waiting for the exact moment when the overlap between the guards and the drones left a fleeting, imperceptible gap. It wasn't more than a few seconds, but it was enough. The sniper reached the designated position, taking cover behind a piece of debris from an earlier skirmish, and raised the rifle, focusing through the scope. The target was inside, visible through a small, transparent viewport in the command center. Even at this distance, the sniper could make out the target's movements, confident, assured, surrounded by subordinates who followed their every command. The leader believed they were untouchable, hidden behind layers of shields, walls, and technology. But the sniper had found the weak spot, the one angle that bypassed it all. The calculations were complete, the conditions perfect. The sniper exhaled slowly, steadying the rifle, finger brushing the trigger. This was the moment that everything had been building toward. The culmination of all the training, the missions, the kills, one shot that could change the course of the war. The target was in position, the path clear. The sniper's mind emptied of all distractions. Focus narrowed to a single point, the target's form centered in the crosshairs. And then the trigger was pulled. The sound of the shot was barely audible, the rifle designed to fire with almost no recoil or noise. The bullet traveled silently, cutting through the air, through the layers of the compound's defenses, exploiting the gap in the shields that the sniper had identified. In less than a second, it was over. The target collapsed, a single hole through their chest, the expression of shock still frozen on their face. The room within the command center erupted into chaos. The subordinates scrambled, shouting into comms, calling for reinforcements, demanding answers as they desperately tried to piece together what had just happened. The guards outside rushed to secure the area, their movements frantic as they swept the perimeter for any sign of the attacker. But the sniper was already gone, slipping back into the shadows, unnoticed, unseen. The alien forces had prepared for everything except a human who could strike from the darkness, adapt to any situation, and exploit the one flaw in their otherwise impenetrable defenses. The assassination sent shockwaves through the coalition's ranks. News of the leader's death spread quickly, and with it came the realization that no one, no matter how protected, was safe from Earth's snipers. The strategic mind behind the coalition's operations had been silenced. The chain of command was in disarray, and the remaining commanders, now terrified of being next, started making mistakes, pulling forces back to protect key leaders, diverting resources from the front lines in a desperate attempt to shore up their defenses. The pressure that the coalition had placed on Earth and its allies began to ease, as confusion and fear gripped their forces. For the sniper, the mission was complete. Another target eliminated, another blow struck in a war that had long since turned against the coalition. But there was no celebration, no moment of triumph. This was just one battle in a much larger war. The sniper knew there would be more missions, more targets, more opportunities to turn the tide even further in humanity's favor. The coalition had underestimated Earth from the beginning. They had relied too heavily on their technology, on their belief that no force in the galaxy could challenge them. But they had never faced an enemy like this, an enemy that didn't play by the same rules, that didn't need fleets or overwhelming firepower to win. All it took was a single shot from a sniper they never saw coming. The war wasn't over, but the snipers had proven a point that no amount of alien technology could deny. Humanity wasn't just another species to be conquered. They were a force to be reckoned with, and as long as there was one sniper left standing, the coalition would never be safe. The hunt would continue, one target at a time, until the galaxy understood that Earth's soldiers, though few, were capable of bringing down even the most powerful empires.